All right, so well, good afternoon. I'm sorry to break up the party here. It's so wonderful to see everyone mingle in person. Well, good afternoon. I'm pleased and honored on behalf of the Department of Epidemiology and the Columbia University Epidemiology Grand Rounds Committee, welcome you to the Alan Berkman Memorial Lecture. I appreciate the time that you've taken to join us, those here in person and those online, near and far. I'll try to keep my introductory remarks brief as we have a lot more to sort of talk about. Sorry, okay, it's better? All right. Yes, okay, that's no problem. Okay, is that better? Okay, this Grand Rounds event is particularly special to our community and our greater community at large. I want to first say a few words about Alan Berkman. Alan, as many of you know, was a tireless advocate for social justice. And for this, he endured considerable personal risk and hardship. He went from being a clinician to a clinician activist to a clinician activist global public health leader. Upon joining our faculty, he dedicated himself to improving treatment access for HIV positive people around the globe. And for those of you, and I think a lot of you do know him and his story, I certainly urge you to look him up. It is simply amazing, unbelievable, and really inspiring. So what links Alan Berkman with Zena Stein? Well, both were mentors, public health and medical scholars, worked on HIV in South Africa, and most importantly, fighters for social justice, who touched the lives of countless individuals. Under this memorial lecture, we honor and celebrate Zena Stein. Zena's work is easy to understate and exceptionally difficult to overstate. In preparing these words, I was telling Louise earlier today, I found it really difficult to sort of find a nice summary of sort of her body of work, like, you know, because she's really done so much and contributed to and has really made so much possible. Born in the early 1920s in Durban, South Africa, she really led an extraordinary life filled with contributions that still very much resonate today, and certainly amongst this crowd. From running a clinic with her husband, Mervyn Susser, our former chair, in Alexandria Township in Johannesburg under the dark days of apartheid, and pioneering studies of community health, to pressing to expand the early HIV/AIDS response to focus on women and children, to laying the foundations to the field of epigenetics, for instance. Quite remarkable. I want to read a short note from Dean Freed, who couldn't be with us here today. I quote, "I very much regret that due to overseas commitments, I'm unable to join you all today to honor this legendary public health figure. I just want to share very brief words about Zena Stein. She was wondrous in so many ways, and particularly to me, she exemplified the huge impact that public health leaders could have in driving the change needed to create equity in health. She created a standard for all of us to aspire, and I'm so very grateful for her leadership and example. Her work lives on." Linda Freed. Indeed is the case. Zena's work continues in the wave of next generation of public health leaders she has trained, a few listed here who are going to be speaking to us today. She was and is foundational to our discipline and certainly to our department. Up on the slide, you'll see a wonderful series of speakers, including public health professionals inspired by Zena and her children. Before I hand off here, I want to specifically thank Louise Kuhn for her tireless and meticulous work in orchestrating this entire event. Yeah. And Gerald Govia for the logistics and, quite frankly, for making this all happen. Thank you and enjoy.
What a crowd. We know so many of each other, right? I'm so grateful that the Department of Epidemiology at Mailman sponsored this wonderful tribute to Zena at the occasion of the Alan Berkman Lecture, because It's really an honor. This lecture series has been going on and sponsored for over 10 years. It's been based in social justice and human rights. For me, it's been an amazing inspiration, and I hope for everyone who's come, and hope particularly for the students who've come. I want to take credit for Alan and Zena meeting each other. I was the matchmaker, and this is how it happened. I went to the 10th International AIDS Conference in Yokohama, Japan in 1994. And riding from the bus from the airport, I was sitting next to Zena, and we had never met. And we discovered that we were both had done a pre-conference tour to Kyoto. So we spent the next 2 days together, really getting to know each other, chatting. She shared some of her exile from South Africa, and I had been an anti-apartheid activist and had been to Zimbabwe after independence, after the war and independence, and also to Tanzania, meeting with ANC representatives about solidarity and material aid. But then the conversation turned to Alan, who had been out of prison for 2 years, and with great compassion, she listened. And Zena, of course, knew firsthand, she knew firsthand the sacrifices and struggles of people who tried for revolutionary change in their own life, people who were exiled, imprisoned, and killed. So this was the beginning of a discussion. And she immediately said, Alan has to meet my son, Ezra. Well, he did. And the Stein, really fight for Alan at Mailmen changed his life and changed the whole trajectory of the last 17 or 15 years of his life. Alan and I were PNS students, and Alan did an internship at Columbia, and I went to Roosevelt. And so this was the period between 1967 and 1972. And New York City was a hotbed of social movements that were very militant. We were able to meet with people and build solidarity with people from the Black Panther Party, from the Black Liberation Movement, from the Young Lords, the Puerto Rican independence movement, and certainly representatives from the Southern African liberation movements. It totally changed our perspective as young medical students. We really learned that our activism had to really, go at the heart of structural white supremacy, imperialism, and colonialism. And, but at the same time, we were young doctors and loved doing our medical work. And the connection between our profession and doctoring and the activism really did not come together until much later in Alan's life, which Zena had a whole lot to do with. Sorry, I'm getting a little dry. Remarkably, when Alan met Zena and Ezra in the mid-1990s, he had regained his medical license and was caring for people with advanced HIV. Ezra went through hoops to have Alan hired at Mailmen, and to, in that time, particularly work with people with HIV and with mental illness, both in New York City and in South Africa. But this really began the relationship between Alan, the Susser family, in particular Zena and Mervyn. He really began to see how you could integrate his medical profession and his politics and activism. The HIV pandemic was engulfing the global South at that time, challenging scientists and activists to respond. And he had learned public health principles primarily from the Stein family, and really knew that public health had to be grounded in the social determinants of health. And with HIV, we all know at this point that in each society, it was the human rights issues that really said who was going to be impacted and infected with HIV. Racism, poverty, stigma. It was all the issues that you could not fight the epidemic without that. And those principles were key to the understanding that he gained. In In 1998, I'm sorry. Alan always came away with the discussions with Zena in particular by saying, she's so brilliant. But he also said, I can never win an argument. And if anybody knew Alan, that was really difficult. And that was with almost every time we had the connection. In 1998, Alan and I went to the 12th International AIDS Conference in Geneva, Switzerland. And at that point, the theme was bridging the gap. It was a disgrace. The protease inhibitors had been available in the global north for 2 years, saving people's lives. And the drug companies were crowing their successes and taking the participants on these lavish cruises on Lake Geneva with champagne dinners. The slogan was really emptying and insulting. The participation by the people from the global south, scientists and activists, was not present. And the only thing that was offered, the position was that the health systems could not possibly afford antiretroviral medications, and that people couldn't really understand how to take them with the issues of the complexities of the regimens. So what was offered in this conference, the position was that the global south could have prevention methods, but clearly no treatment. Alan was deeply angered. Right after the conference, we visited Dachau, and he was incredibly silent for the entire 10 hours or so from Germany back to Paris, deep in thought. And he referred to, of course, what was over the Dachau gate, never again. And he felt like the willingness to let whole communities in the global south die was absolutely intolerable. So he came home, and with activists here and in South Africa, he developed the slogan, treatment equals hope. He knew from the work of HIV here that you really can't mobilize. If there's no hope and only despair, you can't mobilize communities to resist. So after writing, he wrote a position paper. He consulted with Zaki Ahmed from the Treatment Action Campaign in South Africa, and they wrote a position paper looking towards the next conference in Durban called From Geneva to Durban, Solidarity, Bridging the Gap. And he brought that paper to Zena. She was the first person he brought it to. And he wanted her input and her wisdom. And she said, good ideas, go ahead. So with that position paper, Alan brought together other activists and policy people and helped to found the organization Health Gap, the Health Global Action Project. It was an amazing history. Health Gap played a huge role in the removal of international property rights that Big Pharma used to keep the HIV drugs from generic production. And millions of people then had access to affordable antiretrovirals, still do, through the global south. And Health Gap remains incredibly vigorous and true to its mission. And if anybody wants to donate when the time comes, Health Gap. Through the 2000s to his death, Alan worked at Mailman, and with the solidarity, not charity, always a key principles, projects were developed for capacity building of health systems, infrastructure, and research in South Africa and other impacted countries. And it's this infrastructure that could even begin to fight the COVID epidemic as it came through. And here we are again with the vaccine patents and vaccine apartheid. The struggle continues. It was Zena's influence in the last year of his life, her fervent insistence on addressing the needs of women and girls in the HIV pandemic, that started him on a project to work on an international position paper about the intergenerational nature of HIV with women, girls, and orphans. The relationship to South Africa was so key to Alan's later life and work. Zena and Mervyn hosted these afternoon salons up at Dobbs Ferry. They were so memorable. We met folks from all over the world. The discussions ranged from politics to to medicine, to epidemiology, to ethics, public health. And for me, that continued after Alan died. It's been an amazing, enrichment of my life. I can see Zena coming down the hill from the pool in her 80s and 90s, as sharp and challenging as ever. She would start a vigorous conversation and then suddenly remember that she had invited us all for lunch and forgot to put out any food. But we didn't care. It was hardly needed. Zena was my elder and role model. And as I ascend the ladder of age and become an elder, or am an elder, she remains a role model in the spirit of Mandela and the many other fierce anti-apartheid activists. Scientific rigor, ongoing compassion, a vision for a better world, and an unyielding demand that we all continue to fight for it. That was Zena. As Nelson Mandela said, a winner is a dreamer who never gives up. And I think he could have meant both Zena and Alan. Thank you.
Thank you. We celebrate the life of Zena Stein today on the occasion of the Alan Berkman Memorial Lecture. Alan Berkman was Vice Chair of the Department of Epidemiology, Mailman School of Public Health in the 2000s. He conducted research and was engaged in advocacy work that was instrumental in making global access to HIV care and treatment, which included antiretroviral drugs, a reality for sub-Saharan Africa. Alan Berkman, like Zena Stein, was a beloved educator and with a passionate drive for a just world. The focus of today's celebration is on the intersection of the lives of Alan and Zena. At this intersection is the humanitarian crisis that emerged with the HIV pandemic and its relentless spread across Southern Africa. How do I go forward, Gerald? I'll click it.
No, I got it.
Okay, thanks. I thank all of you for joining with us today in person and online to come together to celebrate and remember the extraordinary life of our beloved Dr. Zena Stein. She fundamentally touched the lives of so many of us, inspiring us to do the very best we can in our work and in our lives. An incisive intellect with a boundless openness and warmth to others, she inspired generations at Columbia and beyond. Many of Columbia University's current and past faculty count Zena as a mentor and an inspiration in their lives. Zena played key leadership roles at Columbia University Medical Center from the time she came to Columbia in the 1960s. She was Associate Dean of Research at Columbia School of Public Health. She helped form and shape what was initially a division of epidemiology and which later became a department of epidemiology. She was a co-founder and a core faculty member of the Sajewski Center, and she founded the HIV Center for, she was a co-founder of the HIV Center for Clinical and Behavioral Studies, and she directed the Epidemiology of Brain Disorders unit at New York State Psychiatric Institute. From the early days of her career as a medical doctor in South Africa, Zena Stein worked very closely with her husband, Mervyn Sassa. We lost Mervyn in 2014, but for those of us who are fortunate to be swept up in the magic of the pair, we know what an intellectual powerhouse they were together. However, what is perhaps most remarkable about them is their love and respect for each other. Two powerful minds met on an equal footing allowing them to thrive individually, yet synergize to include us all. It was the 10th of February, 1990, when Nelson Mandela walked hand in hand with Winnie Mandela out of Victor Verster prison outside Paarl, as captured in this iconic photograph and displayed on the front page of the Cape Times the morning after. Preparations were underway for the first democratic election in South Africa, which was to take place in April 1994. I met Zena and Mervyn for the first time shortly after this photo was taken. At this point, surveillance studies in South Africa were detecting little to no HIV, but no one knew better than Zena and Mervyn that it would come, although no one quite expected how the HIV pandemic would explode over the next 2 decades and wreak havoc with reconstruction and development in South Africa. Zena and Mervyn inspired so many people over so many years and across continents. I've spoken to many of you over the past few weeks, and you have shared your stories of inspiration. Now I'm going to tell you my story. I came to Columbia University School of Public Health in 1991 as a master's student. Zena and Mervyn had organized a GRA for me in the Sajewski Center. I quickly realized that I needed more academic training in epidemiology and continued into the PhD program. Zena was my advisor, and I soon found myself working on mother-to-child transmission of HIV. In the 1990s in New York City, HIV had reached a peak among women, primarily affecting women of color with multiple overlapping social problems and drug dependence. That HIV could be transmitted from mother to child was noticed very soon after HIV was discovered, but epidemiological studies were still underway at this stage, designed to accurately determine the frequency of transmission and to understand its risk factors. Zena drew me into collaborations with the New York City Department of Health, which had a vibrant research and surveillance activities going on in New York City. In collaboration with the city, Zena had established the epidemiology of HIV and AIDS course at Columbia, which is still offered in the Department of Epidemiology today. Zena suggested to the City Department of Health that they link the birth certificate data to the pediatric AIDS case data. Astute and hardworking public health practitioners at the health department were very receptive to her ideas. Mary Ann Chasson and Polly Thomas are some of those who helped us. She had very sophisticated statistical ideas on how to link two cross-sectional databases to provide longitudinal information. Way beyond my rudimentary programming ability, she drew in brilliant biostatisticians, Wei Tsai, Bruce Levin, and others who could immediately appreciate the significance of her insights and could provide the technical backing to realize these ideas. But something explains those twins, Zena would insist, making reference to findings that were emerging that the firstborn of a twin pair is more likely to acquire HIV from its mother than the secondborn. And I'd be off to the library once again, trying to locate yet another article that she'd read that I'd missed in the days long before PubMed and PDF files. And off Zena and I would march to obstetrics, and she'd leave Gina Brown and others to help me as I pored over obstetrics textbooks, trying to understand how we could classify different indications for cesarean deliveries in a way that could help capture the extent of mucosal exposure to HIV during delivery. When our results and others supported their hypothesis that cesarean deliveries reduced the risk of mother-to-child transmission, Zena was quick to point out that it was all very well that we had found that intrapartum events affected HIV transmission, but that was not very useful information. Increased maternal morbidity associated with cesarean deliveries could not justify conducting these to reduce transmission. The weight of her brilliance opened doors for me. I was able to collaborate with compassionate but scientifically rigorous pediatricians in New York City at the front line of caring for the families affected by HIV. Elaine Abrams, Stephen Opardi, Don Thea, and others listened to our ideas and helped strengthen the formulation of our hypotheses as we investigated further factors that affect HIV transmission. Today, every person on this planet knows what a PCR test is, but in the early 1990s, they'd only just been invented, and they were only just starting to be used for pediatric HIV diagnosis. Zena saw how using this new technology could be incorporated into perinatal epidemiology studies to help untangle cause and effect. Through this work, we helped clarify that intrauterine growth retardation was most likely a consequence of intrauterine infection, but preterm delivery was most likely a factor that put neonates at increased risk of intrapartum infection during delivery. These were the years before effective antiretroviral treatment combinations for HIV treatment. HIV infection for both children and adults was a deadly, frightening disease. It was also the years that HIV spread widely to the so-called general population in sub-Saharan Africa, and it was expanding into a catastrophe. Although not an inevitable consequence of being born to a woman with HIV, around 20% of infants born to mothers with HIV will acquire infection during pregnancy or during delivery, and another 10 to 50% postnatally through breastfeeding. At this time when so little could be done, breastfeeding became a contentious issue in the public health community. CDC and most North American and European groups strongly recommended abstinence from all forms of breastfeeding, to the point of criminalizing breastfeeding in several settings. The WHO at this stage, having only just emerged from the battles against the formula companies in the 1970s, were grappling with their own policies. In these early days, WHO made blanket recommendations supporting breastfeeding, ignoring the possibility of HIV transmission. Zena dived fearlessly into this issue, and I learned from her courage and insights and joined her. We published a very simple mathematical model which looked at, among other things, whether there might be a sweet spot for the duration of breastfeeding. The risk of transmission through breastfeeding appeared to be reasonably constant and cumulative, with each additional month adding about 1% of infection. The competing risk of death associated with not breastfeeding persists across all age groups, extending into the second year of life. But the relative risk of death associated with not breastfeeding is concentrated in the first few months of life. Our model showed that weighing these two competing risks put the ideal duration of breastfeeding around 4 months of age. Around this same time, Zena had brought me to work with her colleagues in Durban in the Department of Pediatrics at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. They were studying vitamin A as a potential intervention to reduce mother-to-child transmission. It didn't work as an intervention to reduce transmission, but the data provided by the clinical trial provided an ideal source for use in observational epidemiological analysis. One of the factors we investigated as a possible factor involved the postnatal HIV transmission was the quality of breastfeeding. In particular, whether or not breastfeeding in the first 4 months of life was exclusive. In other words, breast milk and nothing but breast milk. Breastfeeding experts were not surprised when we found that the risk of HIV transmission was lower with exclusive breastfeeding. Virologists were, however, surprised and somewhat skeptical. It would take more than a decade of further research to identify some of the ways by which this association works. Postnatal HIV transmission through breastfeeding also gives us a unique human challenge model that Zena quickly recognized. As part of her training grant for South African scientists, Zena and I set up a study of cellular immune responses in infants born to mothers with HIV. The mother-to-child transmission model gives us a way to look at T-cell responses prior to ongoing exposure to the virus through breast milk. In that way, we can look prospectively at whether these responses are providing protection and not simply epiphenomena of exposure. Neither Zena nor I were or are immunologists, and she suggested that I call a distinguished immunologist at NIH and ask him if he'd be interested to work with us. He had been doing studies of HIV-specific T-cell responses in multiply exposed but uninfected gay men, and not unlike our proposed breastfeeding population. He was indeed interested, and we sent an undergraduate student from Durban to his lab at NIH, who then ran the assays in Durban. At the time, the culture-based techniques were laborious and crude, but planted seeds at the University of KwaZulu-Natal that allowed later groups to build on and expand as the technologies for studying HIV-specific immunity expanded and resources poured into this area of research to buy and set up the expensive equipment needed to conduct this type of research. By the time our group had completed the Zambia exclusive breastfeeding study, which was a collaboration between Columbia University, BU, University Teaching Hospital, Lusaka, and Lusaka Health District in Zambia, it was clear that any curtailment of breastfeeding was not advisable. The increased risk of death, diarrhea, respiratory disease, and poor growth associated with abstinence from breastfeeding did not outweigh the risk of HIV infection, even in the absence of antiretrovirals. Even stopping at 4 months was way too soon. With antiretrovirals, the balance was even clearer. In ZEBS, we went further, demonstrating no matter how thorough the counseling and support and provision of free replacements for breastfeeding, these adverse effects were not mitigated. Over the same time, steadily, there were improvements in access to antiretroviral drugs. First on the prevention front with short course regimens, and then on the treatment front, first restricted to only those on the sickest end of the spectrum, and then steadily expanding to everyone with HIV. This helped shift the balance towards favoring breastfeeding again. Slowly, the pendulum started to swing back towards greater support of breastfeeding. As epidemiologists, we are trained to recognize the value of the randomized clinical trial. And we're also the ones who know most astutely what its limitations are. In the complex world of global public health policy, the demand for clinical trials can sometimes stand as a barrier to progress. Zena was a strong voice against some of the clinical trials of antiretroviral drugs for prevention of sexual transmission of HIV to women. And I read from what we wrote. With the ascendancy of evidence-based medicine, despite its good intentions, epidemiological expertise in study design has taken a back seat to committee-developed rules and checklists for how research is to be done if it is to be allowed to guide policy. One of these rules has been to elevate the randomized controlled trial above all other designs. Here we challenge this rule, arguing that randomized controlled trials, and particularly placebo-controlled trials, are not necessarily ethical, do not necessarily advance scientific understanding of the efficacy of interventions, and can misguide health policies. The crux of Zena's argument was that the trials failed to take human behavior into account, and thus were methodologically unsound. Always far-sighted and visionary in her thinking, the centrality of adherence in considering the impact of PrEP and other antiretroviral strategies for prevention of HIV is now widely recognized. Zena's life was bookended by 2 pandemics. She was born in 1922, just after the so-called Spanish flu epidemic, and she died in November 2021 in the midst of our current SARS-CoV-2 crisis. When I look back on those very dark days of spring 2020, I have never been so proud to be part of Columbia University Medical Center. I saw courage and clear-sightedness of my clinical colleagues on the front lines of dealing with this pandemic. I saw my colleagues in obstetrics and neonatal medicine take remarkable steps to protect breastfeeding. They carefully crafted rooming in policies and practices for newborns and their mothers at a time when we knew so little about this infection and were grappling with the PPE crisis. If Zena was here today, she would immediately go and seek out some of her many friends in OB, in PEDS, in ID, and she would congratulate them. And I think this is what she would say to them. You did a really good job with that rooming in policy back in the spring of 2020, but you know what? It's more than 2 years now, and you still haven't found us a vaccine for the under 5s. Please get working on it. And as she would say to me as I prevaricated and dragged my heels and told her it was much too hard, she'd say, get a move on. I'm too old to be patient. Thank you. And I'm going to turn you over now to Eric Gollop, who was sort of my classmate. She was a few years ahead of me in the PhD program in epidemiology.
Okay. Down and down. What's forward?
This goes forward. This goes back.
Thank
Okay.
you. Okay, how's my volume? Good? Great. Thank you so much, Louise. Thank you for the introduction. And thank you for the historical accounting. It's very inspiring to remember that history and timeline. I'm going to speak about Zena today as a mentor and take a step back to look at the human being. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me today, Louise, the CUEGR, the epidemiology department, and it's a great honor to have the chance to speak about and pay respects to Zena, my mentor, my colleague, and my friend. I think it's fair to say that many of us felt unprepared, unmoored, sort of knocked off balance in response to Zena's passing, because we hadn't really imagined a world, what it would be like without Zena in it. She was such a light, a steady guiding force, urging us on and strengthening us in our work, in our activism. So many of her emails ended with, "Right on, Zena." From 1991 to 1994, after completing my DRPH in epidemiology, I was one of Zena's postdoc fellows at the HIV Center for Clinical and Behavioral Studies. After my fellowship ended, I left Columbia and New York and continued to work with Zena for a couple of years on a study concerned with women in HIV and STI prevention in Philadelphia, another colleague on that study in the audience. And then I moved around quite a bit, moving to Europe and then to Florida and then moved back to New York just several years ago. Our initial relationship as mentor-mentee developed into a lifelong relationship as colleagues and friends. I remember the day I first went to interview with Zena about the fellowship, which had been secured by Zena and Anke Ehrhardt, the center, co-founders of the HIV Center. And though my doctoral studies had focused on cancer epidemiology, I had been forged by the women's health movement coming up in the 1970s, and my true love was reproductive health. Before attending graduate school, I had worked at feminist health clinics in contraceptive care and abortion care in California and in New York. I had chosen epidemiology and public health for my career in order to pursue my politics with greater impact and credibility, and with all the tools the discipline has to offer. And I knew of Zena's focus at the time, women and HIV, and I brought a little sample of a spermicidal film with me to our meeting that I was very excited about. It delivered a contraceptive chemical, nonoxynol 9, into the vagina as it dissolved. I had long worked with women's barrier methods for contraception, and I thought, wrongly as it turned out, that it was a fruitful path for HIV prevention. We quickly got into the topic, and when I pulled out the little square of film, Zena cried out excitedly, "Yes, that's what I've been thinking about too." It was a match made in heaven. She took me on as a mentee, and in the week following, I heard her refer to me as her best friend. I was so honored and humbled, a postdoc she had just met. In the ensuing weeks, however, I realized that Zena had scores of best friends, even hundreds. But of course, it was all right. And in fact, it was wonderful. I had entered into Zena's world, where she had a large and a wide embrace for so many. Together, we worked and published on a number of issues, mainly involving women in HIV prevention, including one of the first acceptability studies of the female condom here in Harlem, and on women in contraceptive safety and policy. We worked on ethics in human subjects research, which was also a deep interest of Zena's. Much of our work addressed the need to recognize the women's specific constellation of risk and vulnerability to HIV, and to produce tools and counseling and advocacy to respond to this dire need that was recognized so late and with such slow progress. I've been reading Susan Reverby's fascinating book, subtitled A Conspirator for Justice, titled Co-Conspirators for Justice, about Alan Berkman's life. And I relate so much to the title, since Zena and I often considered and even called our work together, as I'm sure she did with many, an adventure, a co-conspiracy. We traveled to national and international conferences armed with arguments to engage colleagues. We spent nights in crummy little motel rooms with peeling and faded wallpaper and questionable bed linens to attend morning FDA or NIH hearings on the female condom or on microbicides. And we worked furiously to revise manuscripts at picnic tables, by swimming pools, and on beaches in Florida. We talked science and strategy. We schemed together at her house in Hastings many, many times over tea and meals. Here are some of the shots of us at the time of the 2005 African AIDS Conference in Cape Town at the Kirsten Bosch Gardens on the left. And on the Gulf Coast of Florida, braving the chilly waters in wetsuits, Zena always up for an adventure. And in true Zena style, the email that preceded the wetsuits photo was, "I await the Morrison study. Should I wear a regular swimsuit underneath the wetsuit? Phone me on this and other pressing issues. Love, Z." In another visit to Florida in 2015, Zena came and lectured my epidemiology students and also faculty at the School of Public Health at FIU on a series of topics on the ongoing Ebola outbreak and the Dutch famine study. And on the left, another visit together at the Florida coast another time, and our visit on her last birthday in Pennsylvania in 2021. It's impossible at this point, and with 30 years of friendship with Zena, not to start with her extraordinary human qualities. She was a very genuine person, truly caring about the social and emotional and family lives of colleagues, mentees, staff, neighbors, wanting to listen and hear about their lives, not in the manner of polite inquiry, but as an important part of being in the world with them. She cared. She appreciated all the human challenges, the highs and lows, and the backstories of her colleagues' paths to success, the personal stuff. This was a fundamental part of who they were to Zena, not just their scientific accomplishments. She reflected on these personal challenges and gave thoughtful advice, as she would with family. And what I came to appreciate over time is that her caring and her warmth, her humanity and her love were integral to her work, not merely another set of exceptional gifts she possessed. She worked for people's good, for the health of communities, to advance health equity. And her people connections helped feed her enthusiasm and her optimism, her vision, indeed her joy. They energized her through a good number of disappointments in the slow progress of change. And of course, these connections lent her deep insight. She drew ideas and inspiration from them that she applied to her life's work, always with respect and humility. Zena didn't need a work-life balance because it was all one and the same. I'd like to say something about Zena's fantastic mix of patience and impatience. Her insistence and persistence were legendary, as Louise has alluded to. She was absolutely impatient to get answers to questions that would help move things forward, whether policy or a new analysis or a new study. So many of the questions she worked on were urgent, were consequential in terms of lives, quality of life, human rights. And everyone who knew her or worked around her experienced the buzz, the enthusiasm and energy around her new ideas. She was always going somewhere in her thinking, attacking new projects, and it was up to us to keep up with her. As an impatient person and mentee myself, I would complain sometimes about the delays of weeks or months in a manuscript being published, or the slow rate of a policy change, or language being modified on CDC documents. But Zena, at the same time, carried a deep well of patience. The example of the 30 years between her women's methods paper in the AJPH and an actual microbicidal product going to market is often held up. She was ecstatic about the successes, even that much later. She maintained an inner reserve that allowed her to carry on for the long fight that would eventually lead us to the finish line if it were to be realized in our lifetime. And this was a key lesson I learned from her. And on reflection, this seems to originate in a basic hopefulness, a faith in people, and of course, in scientific progress. As I move forward, though I'll no longer have the benefit of hearing her say it, I will always hear Zena's voice. Carry on, don't give up. And because her conviction and advocacy came from a place of wanting to get it right for the community's welfare, not to be known for getting it right, she also avoided the common pitfall of cynicism, where one can find oneself when expectations are not met, or in the face of repeated failure. Zena's retort after trying to convince colleagues and failing was, "Oh, well, I lost that one. On to the next." Zena helped make me a better person. And of course, she made me a better scientist. My appreciation of the richness of the epidemiologic approach really evolved under Zena's mentorship. For questions as consequential as those she addressed, examining all the epidemiological and other evidence about a putative association, but not hesitating to act once you've integrated it, this was key. As the famous statement goes from Sir Austin Bradford Hill, all scientific work is liable to be upset or modified by advancing knowledge. That does not confer upon us a freedom to ignore the knowledge we already have or postpone the action that it appears to demand at a given time. Zena's shorter version, drawn from the French philosopher and writer Voltaire, regularly cautioned, "Let's not let the perfect be the enemy of the good." At the same time, however, Zena's sharp focus on the gaps in available scientific evidence and filling them in and making sense of seeming contradictions in the data was no less emphasized. When results from one study on a key research question deviated from the findings of 19 others, it was important to understand why, to dig in further in the best traditions of John Snow. This careful and critical approach meant that for many questions, Zena's inquiry was never done. In fact, in my last conversation with her, a week before her death, she was still preoccupied with a question on the safety of certain new hormonal contraceptives that had long been a focus of ours. And she reflected in that conversation, if only we knew the answer. Zena was generous and supportive with her students, her mentees, her junior faculty. She made them each feel as though they had a special and unique contribution to give to the scientific and public health world. In retrospect, she placed a great deal of faith in us, with the belief that we could grow into the new space and with confident leadership and expertise. I remember when I was weighing a job offer in France and one in Philadelphia, and I asked Zena's advice. And although her personal interest was to keep me close, to collaborate more easily, and on paper, the Philly job looked better, she paused after a thorough back and forth on costs and benefits and stated, "Erica, you must go to France. They need you there." She knew and accepted and embraced that her positions and conviction would take her to heated disagreements with colleagues. And she was a fierce and tenacious fighter, a formidable force to reckon with in argument. For me, as a young scientist, these debates could be horribly uncomfortable to watch. And I was in awe of how Zena always acted from a place of respect for colleagues with humility. It was not a personal, ego-driven or fight or challenge that she mounted. It was not an I thing. It was a we thing. For Zena, it was always, we must do better. What she was really saying in argument was, my friends, this is the path forward. Look at the evidence. Zena had a higher sense of her mission than the I, operating on a different level, with an expansive and long-range view, a grasp of what was possible and what must be tried where we needed to go. At age 95, in her lovely and moving speech to accept the South Africa Medical Research Council President's Award, which I suggest you all find and watch, she took issue with the words of a Sufi sage that she saw portrayed in a spiritual community that she lived near in Pennsylvania while living with her daughter Ruth and son-in-law Michael. The sage had warned followers to protect against the poverty of the mind in favor of the wisdom of the heart. And Zena was not happy with this formulation and told the audience, to me, the mind and the heart are so closely connected. Why give up the mind? And instead, she came up with her own formulation at the end of the talk. And hers was, protect forcefully the integrity of the mind and nurture carefully the humanity of the heart. Zena, thank you for lighting the path forward for so many of us and for keeping us conscious of mind and heart and the rightful place for each. Thank you for being my devoted mentor and colleague and my beloved friend. Thank you.
I'm going to invite my another classmate, another sort of classmate, well, two classmates who were a little bit ahead of me in Columbia and were also students of epidemiology, Qureisha and Slim Abdul Karim. So welcome and thank you for joining us.
No, you're going to do that, and this is how to do it. You're going to go back.
Go back, because he'll go first. And
Go. Yeah. Okay, so you go forward.
go, no, okay,
So this is you go forward here,
yeah,
and then you go back here.
okay. Do the slide before.
Slide this one.
No.
Which one?
The
This is
the standard slide.
This is it.
It's okay.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure and honor to be with you here today, especially to be here with you in person. I'd like to thank Louise and Barun for organizing this and inviting us. I know the amount of energy it takes to pull something like this off. Qureisha and I will be splitting our slot, and so I'm going to spend the next 10 minutes telling you about 4 things in my interactions with Zena and what characterized the strength of her personality and the force of her scientific conviction and how that influenced my own life and my own career. It is particularly appropriate that we are here today at the Alan Berkman Lecture. I was honored to know Alan for many years and indeed delivered the first Alan Berkman Memorial Lecture in the series. But it was Zena Stein who introduced me to Alan Berkman. So there is a very strong link as to why I'm doing this talk about Zena Stein in a lecture dedicated to Alan Berkman's memory. I came to Columbia University as a young medical student, just qualified as a doctor, having done 2 years of virology training. And I had never met Mervyn Sasser or Zena Stein, but I had corresponded with them, and they were the ones that enabled me to come here under a Rockefeller Fellowship. So the first day that I arrived to the office, it was the Sergievsky Center. It was in Tower 1, it was on the ground floor. And as I walked in and I was trying to find my way, I see an elderly couple walk in, and I sort of figured that's most likely to be Mervyn Sasser and Zena Stein. Little did I know that Mervyn, in his very traditional cravat, was very easily recognizable. But it was Zena Stein that struck me, because I'm looking at this lady, white hair, she had a calico off-white colored pants and top, and she had sandals. So I said, okay, is this really the person who I'm here to meet, the big shot in charge of all of this? And indeed it was. And so I met Zena Stein for the first time in the Sergievsky Center hallway. And what do you think was the first thing she did? She said, come, I have to take you to meet Nigel. And she introduces me to Nigel Panet. Then she says, no, you must meet Alan Hauser. And then she takes me to meet Catherine Hare and Barbara Godleski, 4 people in the first 5 minutes of having met her. She epitomized the strength of social networks. She epitomized the way in which people can be brought together. And she wanted you to be linked up, to be networked with each other. But that was my first memory, my first interaction with her. The second thing, moving forward many years, when she would come and stay with us in Durban, it was my job to take her and Mervyn early in the morning to go and swim. And they wouldn't just swim anywhere, because we had a pool in our home. No, she wanted to swim in the Rachel Finlayson swimming pool, which is at the beach. And she wanted to swim in the Rachel Finlayson pool, not only because it's an Olympic-sized pool, but because she originally learned to swim from Rachel Finlayson, who won an Olympic medal. So it was that memory for her about what Rachel Finlayson stood for. But I have to tell you that in Durban, it took a very special courage that only Zena had to drive with Mervyn Sasser to go and visit family members. Because Mervyn's idea of driving is his memory of what the roads in Durban used to be when he lived there. I went once, and that was it. From then on, it became my job to take Mervyn and Zena to go and meet family members, and that's how I got to meet all of their family and friends in Durban. The third I want to share with you is that Zena convinced Kuresha and I that we should join the faculty after we finished our studies here in 1988. And we came back a year later to come and teach in the summer. And we loved it so much, we're still here. But one of the things was that I would now regularly come to the US. And I had made this arrangement with her that when I land in JFK, the flight lands at 6 a.m. in the morning, that I'm going to take a cab and I'm going to come to Hastings, because I'm going to go to Hastings, I'm going to shower there. And after I've had my shower, I would sit and have breakfast with her. And then when she's driving into the city, I would get a lift with her, because she had that really good parking right in front of the PI building. I have to tell you, after the third time I did that, I wondered whether this was such a good move, because Zena used the breakfast opportunity to try and get me to become a co-conspirator with her in the latest activism that she's involved in. Initially, it was mainly with Louise Kuhn. She was something or the other, but she needed to convince me to join their cause on breastfeeding, and later with Erica Gollop. And I remember that one breakfast, after about half an hour, I had to say to Zena, let's call it a truce. Because this was Zena arguing with me about a study called a fact study, which she was dead against. Right? There's about a study that we had previously, Croatia and I had shown that tenofovir in a gel form prevented HIV. And I remember having long discussions with Bruce Levin on it and many others. And she didn't believe that this follow-up study should be done. And I kept saying to her, but it needs to be done. No, it didn't need to be done. And she literally, you see this ear is a bit bent. It's bent from that time when she was trying to convince me that this is not a good idea. And Sharon Hillier was doing another study, not a good idea, that they should really be doing different studies. But all of that was in the spirit of trying to ensure that we were doing the best science. It was never personal. It was all in good spirit. It was all about trying to find the best path forward. And I deeply admired her for those occasions. And finally, I want to just say to all of you how touched we were to have had the opportunity to go and visit her in September last year. We hadn't been able to travel to the US for almost 2 years. And when we came, we said the first thing we're going to do is going to see Zena. And so we took the train to go and visit her at Ruth's home with Michael. And in that visit, one of the first things that Zena wanted to know after the pleasantries was she wanted to know about how our anti-HIV antibody research was going. And so I had to say, relax, after lunch, I want to sit down and tell you the whole story. And you know what she said to us? So after that, she said, no, she came with us to the train station. She saw us off at the train station. And as we leave, she said, don't forget to send me the papers. And that was her. She was the consummate intellectual, scientist, activist. She never saw them as separate. Her quest to make the world a better place was integrally linked with her quest to be a great scientist. Thank you.
Greetings, friends and colleagues. I think as we gathered here today, we are all remembering different things as each person has spoken. And I think there are some common traits that we all recall about Zena. There's only one Zena Stein. And as much as we always visualize Zena and Mervyn together, Zena was her own person and quite an exceptional and iconic person. I loved what Erica said about, you know, you feel so special. She's your best friend, or Louise sharing that similarly or something. But the reality is she was an exceptional human being. And I was wondering, as I was thinking about what to share on this occasion, and having the privilege and the honor to be here in person and to be part of this hybrid celebration that Louise very carefully curated for us. Thank you very much for that. Is that something that we wouldn't have heard of a lot, but also brings Alan and Zena together, is the issues around global health and building capacity for global health. And I think these past 2 years, initially, we were reminded about our interconnectedness, because the SARS-CoV-2 virus didn't respect any geographical boundaries or anything. And we had a shared vulnerability. But come November 2020, suddenly all the divides between North and South became really apparent, because we had, wow, fantastic scientific breakthrough, 6 vaccines, unprecedented in the history of our lives on Earth. And yet, at the same time, suddenly it was those who could have that, and those who haven't, again, were at the bottom of the pile. And there's been a lot of talk about building regional capacity and self-sufficiency, building national capacity and self-sufficiency. And I thought that, as usual, Zena was way ahead of her time, and had the insight way back in 1992, even before democracy in South Africa, to establish the Columbia University Southern African Poverty AIDS Training Program. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the same themes and characteristics of Zena, and how this insight and foresight she had changed a whole region and its response to HIV and TB. And I think if we look in other parts of the world, we can see the story repeated. You can see it in New York City, how together with Anka Herhart, setting up the HIV Center changed the response in New York. But it's that combination of things that makes Zena like exceptional. I don't think there's a computer out there that can imitate this supreme intellect that we were privileged to see. It's that father who was a mathematician, who imbibed in her DNA something about precision in measurement, rigor, and so on. And a mother who really was the epitome of social justice. We had large numbers of Lithuanians, other Eastern Europeans arriving in South Africa just before and after the First World War. And she saw that and lived that. But as good children do, they don't do what parents tell them. They do what they see their parents do. And I believe her history studies up to master's level before the Second World War was also integrated some way in making her this very unique person that she is. But in 1992, Slim and I had recently completed one of the first population-based surveys to quantify an evolving and emerging epidemic in South Africa, and the prevalence was less than 1%. So if you asked, and maybe this is the one time I'll speak on behalf of Slim, if you asked us in 1990, what would the trajectory of HIV in South Africa be? I don't think we would have predicted that by the time we had come 2 years later, that not only had the prevalence quadrupled, but that we would have this exponential growth of HIV, and South Africa would be home to 1 of 5 global infections taking place, and today is home to 1 in 5 people living with HIV. What Zena saw in those early days, just after the unbanning of the extra parliamentary bodies and the move and the transition towards democracy, which didn't happen until until the 27th of April, 1994, was the big knowledge gap that we had in terms of responding to this new and emerging epidemic. And so she applied for a grant to the NIH to set up this program. And in her unique way, it wasn't simply a training program where we will bring people from South Africa to do epi training at Columbia University and return. But that, she said, firstly, it had to be a regional program. It had to be South Africa, Lesotho, Swaziland, Namibia, and Botswana. Secondly, when we recruited, it had to be through a very wide network of recruitment so that we would get the best. This was a very modest sum of money. We could only bring about 2 or 3 people each year to New York. But she also did something else, which is gathered a whole team of senior faculty. And I'm so pleased Ron Bayer is here and others, and Wafa Al-Sada, Ezra, Mervyn would come out, Anka would come out. And each year they would come to South Africa around January, and they would teach what we were learning at that stage about HIV to policymakers, to scientists at institute, and they would travel across South Africa, mainly in the big cities, in Johannesburg, Cape Town, and in Durban, and they would share knowledge about some of the challenges. Ron talking about some of the ethical issues around surveillance system and around testing and all the issues, so that we would leapfrog ourselves the next stage, learn how to do clinical trials, how to do the descriptive studies, how to do those analytical studies. So this faculty, the steering committee would arrive. Each one of them were matched with a South African. And they would go through this process of going around. Each of these workshops that they hosted would have some of the potential applicants there. And so there was an opportunity for one-on-one, but it didn't end there. When they arrived in South Africa, in New York City at JFK, I don't know, if you've never traveled in your life and you arrive in JFK, it is quite something. But Zena would arrange for somebody to pick you up. And I remember in 1988, Slim and I had been married a week and had just arrived, and Zena sent Ari Stein off to JFK to pick us from the airport and bring us. And later that day, she and Mervyn came up to make sure everything was okay. It was that warmth and hospitality that she extended. And I see David, who's at the back of the room, that we all knew, Moni Sengupta knew. When those students arrived from South Africa, they really needed a lot of hand-holding and transitioning to life in New York. Some of them came from very rural communities. But that was the wisdom and insight with which she set this up. But it was also about setting partnerships up. And in setting up and training people, it was the partnerships within the US. And as the epidemic evolved, as our knowledge evolved, she moved the program from simple training on epidemiology, very important because the South African apartheid government saw public health training and particularly epidemiology as subversive. And Zena knew that gap needed to be filled. We needed schools of public health, and those were not going to drop. And so this partnership and collaboration, following the students back to South Africa, making sure people like Sharon Schwartz, I just have a few pictures here, Alfredo, Gualing, coming to South Africa at different times, gathering the flocks of people who were trained before, teaching them what are the new methodologies that have emerged since their training, but also following up on what research they were doing and how connecting them with faculty in the US, the right faculty, so that we could move from the epi studies to looking at the basic science, looking at the ethical and human rights considerations. Excuse me. And this would go on year after year. And I think you've heard from Barbara, from Louise, and from Erica. About the year 2000 and what a pivotal moment it was. The conference for the first time held in South Africa. And there were 3 issues, I think, that had impact both at Columbia University and also in South Africa. It was the issue of treatment access and the global solidarity. And I remember Alan coming out and Jerry Friedland and spending time teaching our clinicians who at that time, very few knew how to make antiretroviral treatment available, to do that to scale and to ensure that the approximately 7 million people who were infected at that time and in need of antiretroviral treatment could access it. Not to be forgotten, while we've made huge advances on preventing mother-to-child transmission, she had recruited Dean Rosenfield at the time to do one of the plenary talks, which is, where is the M in the PMTCT? We had focused on the infants, but forgotten the mothers. And shortly after that, Rockefeller Foundation set up the PMCT Plus program, which was the precursor to ICAP. Then the microbicides you've heard about, so I'll move on. I was recalling that the first time I met Zena, she was well into her 60s. And I think several of us in the room are sort of at that point now. And it's always a reminder for me, that energy and enthusiasm. So whenever I feel myself flailing, I always think about it. And I also think about the last time I saw Zena, where she had just celebrated her 99th birthday and was as enthusiastic. So when people say, as you get older, you become risk averse, there wasn't Zena. If anything, she was right out there. What is the thing? And being able to join the dots and bring people together, come together as for as long as Mervyn and her could travel. They were there every year and doing this tour. In addition to the South African tour, Zena and I would catch daily flights to the neighboring countries, to Swaziland, Lesotho, and Namibia, and meet up with our colleagues there and see what was going on. So I think as we think about just her role in HIV, this capacity building, and I just put some of the faces, over 600 scientists in South Africa were trained through this program. Many of them are leading figures in the world. They're heading major institutions, very senior positions in different multilateral agencies, as well as leading institutions in South Africa and in the region. But importantly, I think that, as I started off saying about COVID, a lot of these individuals who had been a strong investment in this training program were also able to pivot and enhance our response to COVID. So we did participate in those COVID vaccine trials because we had the clinical trial capacity, we had the scientists on board, and it wasn't enough, but at least it helped us manage and mitigate a new pandemic through investments that were made in HIV, through investments made in people. And the people investment wasn't simply on a disease. And as Zena would be the first to say, that no pandemic, we can't keep moving our gaze from one pandemic to another while we've not completed the others. So now we have a collection of incomplete pandemics, and that has to stop. We really have to take a different approach to the challenges that face us. And we've got to look at the intersectionality and the interconnectedness and see how we can join the dots so that no population, no community is left vulnerable. And I think just to echo, Alan was a very close ally in all of these capacity and training activities, is that there is no room for complacency. And our job is not done until we can ensure some of those SDG goals with the 2030 targets are met, because it is fundamentally about these vulnerabilities and structural challenges that make some communities more vulnerable than others. And until we start to address those, we have to use the science as a stopgap measure to get us closer to those goals. But our job is not done until that science can reach the beneficiaries from all of that, and we free from these challenges that curtail some lives and allow others to thrive. Thank you very much. And I just wanted to end with this African farewell to Zena Hambagashle, to an iconic scientist, a fearless leader, a generous mentor, a networker, a dear friend, a critical colleague, a passionate and courageous advocate. a uniquely wise, amazing, and inspiring human being who enriched all of our lives and will continue to do so as we carry on the tradition and legacy they've established. Thank you.
And for the final section of our program, we're going to move on to family. And we're going to start with Zena Stein's son, Ezra Sasa.
Great, thanks.
Okay, you can go ahead,
So-
Ezra.
Yeah, thanks everybody for all of those people involved in organizing this lovely occasion, and which it really is. I thought I would say a few words about parts of Zena that you may not know so much about, because as Qureshi said, she was nearly 70 when she got involved in HIV, which is what most people in the live audience, at least, know her for. But the same things were true throughout her life. And if you want, to me, the most compelling story about both Zena and Mervyn was a piece written by Richard Neugebauer and Nigel Panner in 1992, when she was 70, when Mervyn retired. And I'm going to focus more on that earlier part. And I'm going to talk about some things that you may not know about, but are consistent with everything you've heard. She shared a lot, with Alan Berkman. They both had hundreds of friends, hundreds of best friends, and they both were totally committed to social justice, and scientific integrity. It's remarkable, really, how much they shared that. I'm just going to talk a bit about the first theme that I see, the social justice, scientific integrity, because other people have done that, but more as a context for the other part, which is her lifetime friendships and her generosity. And most important to me, the principle of social inclusion that she always had. So this is really for background. I guess I can't, the slides are, never mind. So, the first major project that they worked on was in Alexandra Township in Johannesburg. And, that was, I don't know if you can see the slides, I can't, but if you can see the pictures anyway. This was in a poor community, and it was kind of the formation of the working class in South Africa. And, population changing from a rural to industrial society, isolated, fragmented industrial families, very poor. And, they and their friends, who were kind of in a commune in a sense, developed a community health program there, which they wrote up in the Lancet. But they then were, I guess you could say, exiles. They left for England, and a lot of people aren't aware of this, I think, of the incredible work that they did when they were in Manchester, in England. And I'm just noting two of the things here of many. One is that they completely reimagined the health services in Salford, which is a town right next to Manchester. It's very famous, really, because it was where Engels had his factories, supported Marx from the profits from those factories. It's also Coronation Street. Some of you might know about the longest running TV program in England was based in Salford. It was very poor and very symbolic. And they just completely changed the mental health services there. And they had a huge impact on the people that they worked with there. And they also were examining, especially social causes of intellectual disability and of mental disorders. There's a whole phase of their life, really, and of all our lives in the family, that you can easily get obscured by everything that came later in her life. And then in New York, before HIV, they set up the premier center for perinatal and pediatric epidemiology. And you know, I think about the work on nutrition and development, Dutch famine study being just one part of that. But a lot of people may not know that with Maureen Durkin, Zena started an international study of child disabilities in developing countries. It was, I think, the first study of that kind to be done. And it was motivated by the same kind of things that you've been hearing about from later in her life. And, you know, I went with her on several of the trips that they made to, you know, for this study. And like everyone else has said, you meet incredible people and see incredible things when you go with them on these journeys. So I'm going to move on from this, talk about some things about Zena that have been referred to, but just to give a little more the actual person to it. So she was lifetime friends with literally, I think, hundreds of people, but real friends. So the first picture there is with Cynthia Loft. That was her best friend in school in Durban. And they were friends until Cynthia died just a few years ago. They never lost communication and friendship. Second picture is of Zena with Fiona Stoll, who was her best friend when she was doing her undergraduate degree in Cape Town. And they also kept up that relationship, you know, right until the end. And there was like a bond between them that lasted forever. And then the third picture is with Edith Waldman and Michael Hawthorne. And Edith Waldman and Michael Hawthorne both worked at Alexandra Clinic in Johannesburg with Zena and Mervyn. And then there they are with Zena in late life, still close friends, still getting those kind of messages that Horatio described and Slim described. And then you move on to Manchester, and this is a picture of Zena with Joyce Leeson, who was one of the people that we're still in touch with, and with her family. And you see they're still going strong there at, age 99, something like that. And we still exchange emails after Zena's death, you know, because she just had such a kind of bond with people. And well, I'll stop there. And then the last one is with Nigel Paneth, who they met when he started a Sajewski Center in perinatal epidemiology, and they were close friends throughout life, you know, never stopped. And I could mention so many others, you know, there's Mary Claire King, you know, these are just examples, because she had hundreds of lifetime friends, and but they're all real, you know. I think everyone in the pictures, if they're alive, you know, will see it, will understand that it was real, you know. It's not just that she knew hundreds of people, but they were really close to her, as I think Erica was describing. And that's a quality one quality out of the hundreds that I think I picked up from her, and not all the others. And the other part of her that has been mentioned, but I just want to make it real for you, is her generosity. They were always in our house, wherever we were, South Africa, Manchester, New York. There were always refugees and exiles who were staying in our house, the children of friends, and the friends of their children. So for 3 examples, one is here, Eli Valencia, who came from a concentration camp in Chile, to New York as a refugee, and he lived with us. We became friends. He's kind of like a brother to me, and you know that's also an ongoing relationship. And then the children and friends. Julian Pollock is one of many examples, but you know he's still been in touch with Zena and with the whole family in a wonderful way, and she was friends with his parents. And but there were always at least 2 people like this staying in our house. And then with the friends of children, these are my 2 best friends from age 5. Now they've grown up there in Manchester, but I've kept in touch with them. And what they always say is that there was always, like the one there, Chris on the left with the red hair, he spent more time at our house than at his own, because he said, well, first, my parents were much more tolerant, you know, and let us do what we want. But it was also that there was always a place at the table for anybody who happened to be there. So he'd just stay and have dinner with us and so on. And it had a big impact on him too, and on Mark. But this is the thing that I think I got the most from personally, out of being part of Zena's family. And that's the idea of social inclusion, because it wasn't just people that were colleagues or that were in the, you know, the children and so forth. It was, they really, they always had a place for people who had nowhere else to go. And a good example of that is a person called Thomas Ronsheim, who I got to be very close with over time. He had schizophrenia, and he was the son of one of the people that her mother, as Kuresha had mentioned, had, you know, her mother helped set up. She came as a refugee to Durban, and Tom was her child, and he developed schizophrenia, a very complicated life. He was homeless in New York for about 10 years. And he came to, he contacted Mervyn and Zena for help. And, you know, Zena went all out to try to help him. And he had a difficult life. He was re-hospitalized many times, but he really became a member of the family. And he came to every Thanksgiving that we had. He came to, you know, every major family event. And he lived in this, when he got a place to live, he lived in this place called Lefrak City, which was really, his apartment was indescribably, I don't know how to put it. It was dirty, and, you know, everything was all over the place. And it was difficult. Anyone that we hired to clean it up for him would never go again, because it was that difficult. But he was always welcome at our house. We visited him there. He had a huge fund of knowledge. You know, he wasn't just like a person with schizophrenia. He was, I learned a lot from him. He knew more about New York than anyone else I've met. And, you know, he stayed at our house in the later years, and he's buried in the back garden of our house, his ashes. And, you know, I think I learned, that's something I really learned from Zena, is that there's always a place at the table for people in all kinds of situations. And then finally, it's true within the family too. You know, I can't think of anyone else in the family, including Mervyn, who was loved by everybody in the family of all kinds and ages. And, you know, I don't know why or how, but I guess it has to do with what we've been talking about. And that's just exemplified in this scene here, a coming of age ceremony that you know, that she created, because there were so many children who were in grandchildren of hers who were, but not just grandchildren, also the children of nieces and nephews and so forth, who they were of different religions or no religion, you know, Muslim, atheist, Jewish, Christian, whatever. And so she invented a coming of age ceremony that that everyone could participate in. And that's just illustrated here. And we had this in the garden in Hastings. She was just an extraordinary person. I feel very lucky to have had a mother like her. And that's really my strongest feeling after she passed away. So with that, I'm gonna pass on to Ida, who will share her thoughts with you. Thanks.
Thank you, Ezra. And we're going to try, Gerald, can you help us switch over to Ida slides? No, you can't, because it's just very far away.
Ida.
So,
Let's get the right place.
so this is to advance. This is to advance your slides. This is to
Okay.
advance, and this is to go back. Okay?
Okay, all right. Thank you. Is that right now? Am I in the right place? Okay. So I just wanted to thank Louise, who put her heart into this and really brought us all together in a beautiful way for a beautiful event. And also all the speakers, I mean, it is like family, and everybody like Erica and Louise and Horatio and Slim, and then Ezra, it is the people that my mother brought to us as family. And especially I wanted to mention Alan and Barbara, because it's very important to me to be speaking at this event in memory of Alan and with Barbara here, because I think they were a symbol to us, along with my parents, of the importance of social justice and the connection between what you do and what you think and how you live, you know? And I think my mother she would have loved every minute. And this is her family, you know? And it's very important that, you know, people's children, I know all the children, and we know all the children, and she brought us a family. Like Erica said, everybody's her family, everybody's her best friend, but it's not really exactly like that. But we felt that this was our family, along with Tom Ronsheim, as Ezra mentioned, who was, his mother and father had come from Germany as exiles, Jewish exiles, and my grandmother helped them, and my mother helped them all their lives, both of them, Tom and his brother, the twins. So we were brought up, what I wanted to say is, we were really brought up by politics. We couldn't avoid it. We couldn't think any different. We had no choice. And that was just the way. And when people say, you know, how we brought up, your mother was always working or your father, but we had to be there too. I mean, we were brought everywhere, you know? So when I was 8, I was organizing around Sharpeville in my little elementary school to get money, and Dad would send it to some canon, I forget what his name was, in a church that sent money to South Africa. Famous man, I forgot his name. And then after that, when we were in Manchester, that Ezra mentioned, we would march down the streets in the rain, 20 people with signs about anti-apartheid in the rain. It was always in the rain. And that's how we lived. We couldn't get away from. And then when Harold Walpy got out of jail, or anybody got out of jail, they came to Manchester. And my dad and mom organized with their South Africa. They always had a South Africa committee, whether it was in Manchester or in Hastings or in America, in New York. So they organized a talk for Harold. I don't think anybody in Manchester ever heard of Harold Walpy, but there were 50, 60 people in the room, I remember. And I thought they were great. And then in our garden, if they couldn't get a room, they would have these people coming through, political escapees, talking in our garden in Manchester. So like it was just part of our lives. So when we came to New York, sort of thought I would escape. And I thought I'd do my own politics. And I got arrested in '68 and manacled to Susan Mailer, Norman Mailer's daughter, and ended up in the Tombs. And my mom and dad came all supportive. Like I didn't want it that way. I wanted to be a bit rebellious. And I didn't want them really to like adopt it with that openness and give money to the New York lawyers. And that wasn't right, you know? Anyway, I couldn't rebel exactly. So I did go into anthropology and I did write a book about New York City. And then I went to Puerto Rico and worked on the exploitation of health hazards. But then HIV came to Puerto Rico and New York City and back, like my mom brought me back in. And like I never, like, so then, oh, pictures. She loved the Drakensberg. We'll give you another picture. There she is. And then she set up this AIDS work with Anka. And she said, oh, Ida, you're the director of the AIDS International Anthropology Group, which didn't exist, had no money. So I went and got two of my mentors from Columbia, George Bond, who was the brother of Julian Bond, and Joan Vincent. And I called them our AIDS Anthropology Group with John Krasinski, my husband. And we did things. And she funded both George Bond to go to Zimbabwe and Joan Vincent to go to Uganda to do research on HIV, one of the first anthropology of research. And then she funded John and I to go to Dominican Republic, and we were already in Puerto Rico. And we actually put together a book, an edited book. We had a conference at Columbia. That was because she said, like, this is what you have to do now. Ezra also brought me into HIV. There's my mom and dad and me. Ezra, that's when they were at Alexandra Clinic. Ezra brought me into working with homelessness, and then it turned out to be HIV. And then my mom said, all right, now South Africa. And I did this work in Puerto Rico. I did this work in Puerto Rico around community HIV. And she said, oh, you've got to do that in South Africa. She put me in touch with Croatia, and Croatia got funding. And we landed, me and my two-year-old and my 7-year-old, who are here somewhere now, 40 and 35, 32. And we landed there, and Croatia and Slim had Sephora, and they adopted us and took us all around. And Croatia and I and my mother worked on this community prevention of HIV in Durban. And so that was how she kind of just, you couldn't avoid her, like everybody said. You had to do what she said. But she was a mother who helped. She wasn't a grandmother who stayed home and babysat. I do that. But no, but if you went with her, like if I went to Durban, she was helping me with the children. And we went then later on, having gotten into HIV, I went to the Durban 2000 meeting with all these wonderful people. But then I brought my children and they slept on her floor and my floor. At the Barcelona AIDS meeting, this is the Thai ones in 2004, that's Saji who's here, Joe who's here, and she just took us wherever. And Jonah started writing on HIV. She just wrote with me for the ongoing newspapers on HIV. We went, when Erica got into a debate, we went to those debates. Like she just dragged us into everything, and we were in her shadow, but we loved it. It was the most exciting life. And so anyway, and I also, nobody has mentioned, which really wasn't anything to do with me, but she organized in 1990 a huge conference on HIV in Maputo, where, as I think Croatia and Slim said, she knew, or she believed, that HIV was going to be the issue in South Africa. And she wrote to Mandela And it was not yet freedom, it was not like liberation, so they had to have it in Maputo. But they brought, for example, Cyril Ramaphosa, who was the union leader of the mine workers at that time. They brought him to Maputo, and he was very in favor of working on AIDS prevention and things like that. I mean, many, many people that you would have heard about since were there. And one of the things I did was kind of write a history of that. And then I managed to work on other things like in recent years. And I also went with a very sad story with Dr. Tavares to the Dominican Republic with John Krasinski. And then he was a wonderful, wonderful doctor here of HIV. And he died like 2 weeks later of AIDS. But we were with him in the Dominican Republic with my mom sending us there. So I just wanted to say that everything that she did, she engaged all of us. And she passed on her spirit and gave us a family that you see here today. And it went down to the grandchildren. That's what I want to show. Like when she was gardening, Philip and Leah would garden, right? That's her grandchildren. Whatever she was doing, whatever they were doing, I wouldn't garden. I said, you can't take me to garden. I love the garden. But she got the grandchildren, and there she got us all. And there she's got Bear gardening, you know, even at whatever age. And and this is an overdose of grandchildren. That's her great grandchild, Rafi, just born before. She said she wanted to live until Rafi was born and she could see Rafi. She didn't know what his name was going to be. We didn't know he was going to be a boy, but she was going to stick around. She didn't care about her 100th birthday, but she was going to stick around until there was this newest great grandchild. So she had spirit and she had love and she made family. And she really, I think Erica said this, she didn't have that conflict of family and work that you read about in all the newspapers all the time. She just took us along and you just had to be there. If it was Harold Walby talking and you were 8, you had to listen. Or even if you were 3, I don't think Ruthie would remember, but you were there. Anyway, so that's how they lived their lives. And I think they were wonderful, she and my father, but they were just an inspiration and a model to all of us. And
And for the last word on today's program, I'm very pleased to welcome Ruth King, who's Zena, Stein and Mervyn Sassa's youngest daughter.
So you're just going to use
Yeah.
this one?
I'm a bit nervous now. Well, everybody, I have to say, everything everybody said was just amazing. And oh, can you hear me? Okay. I just wanted to thank everybody Louise who set this up, and everyone who said everything else was amazing and just felt so true. And I'm going to try and go a little quicker because I've got too many slides here. But Mom came to live with me in the last few years of her life. So I'm mainly going to talk about that. Whoops, I did something wrong. Oh, maybe I didn't. Okay. Anyway, just have she, apart from all her friends, keeping up with all the friends, she also just, kept up with very closely with our extended family. And this is just a couple of pictures of that. My uncle's family in Israel and my other uncles, them visited them in London. And this is our closer extended family at one of our gatherings. And when Ezra's family were school age, he moved into the Hastings house when my parents lived, and they moved down to the basement. And this is just a picture of, so we all stayed very close. And there's Leah, Ezra's older daughter, with her son. And Ezra would every evening go and chat with Mom and Dad. So like, that's what I'm just an example of staying close And then Ida moved into Hastings, Ezra moved back to the city. And she had them they had dinner together every night. And then here's that was the first great grandbaby, Philip's son. That Mum and I went to South Africa right after this, and she took that picture and showed it to everybody. And so then Mum moved down to live with me. And we had her at a time when she wasn't mostly working. So she had more time for like memories of old times and reflection and poetry. And we really thoroughly enjoyed it. When she did have work, like somebody wrote to her or something, she was very energized by that. And she also at this time reflected some on things she might have done wrong in her earlier life, which to us, the things she thought of seemed very minor and few. But one example was somebody's research proposal that she hadn't supported. And later she thought, well, maybe she should have supported that. But luckily that person's career went very well without that. Another one was when she remembered when Ida was a teenager and she'd insisted Ida come on a family walk, which we did every Sunday together and Ida didn't want to, but there was a young visitor coming. She apologized to Ida 60 years later, and Ida assured her there was no harm done. So then while she was with us, it was a great boon for my immediate family and all of my friends. And here you can just see some of our enjoyment of her. She was warm, welcoming, positive, and proactive. And she always, if she saw something needed to be done, she spoke up and acted. And she would make, as people noticed, she would make fast friends with people within a few minutes of conversation. And these are some of my friends above, and this is Claude's mom. I just love that picture of mom with Claude Mellon's mom. And the other thing I wanted to say, she always had poetry for every occasion. And she remembered the poetry, like she'd remembered like the whole Pied Piper, however many pages long, by heart. She remembered a poem about Jane Austen and that she had learned in her 20s. And it's a very, very long poem. We've never been able to find the author. So Mum we typed it from her memory. We've written to all the Jane Austen clubs everywhere. Nobody remembers. So Mum said, well, it might as well be hers now. So finally, she just, as of old Edith, who Ezra showed a picture of, Edith Woman, who was a friend from the South African days. Mum was always for fun. She loved ice cream here. And we learned so much from being with her. It was a great example, and we're very grateful. Oh, what I forgot, okay. And yeah, I forgot the part I was meaning to say. So she, in the last couple of years before she died, she felt she was weakening and felt death coming. And so Ida arranged a phone call with the rabbi who'd done a small ceremony after my dad died. And he said to her, well, like what, because that was the only time we'd met the rabbi when my dad died, except for they sold their first house to him many, many years before. So he said, well, what should I say about you? What kind of thing? And he said, well, maybe, I could say you're a woman of valor, or which is also interpreted as a good wife. And that didn't speak to Mum at all. So she then wrote this email to my Uncle Wilfred. How would you describe a person who is righteous? Maybe a man, maybe a woman, maybe an intersex, whatever. Is there a neutral word for righteous that one could use for a funeral? What does Dahlia think? Well, Dahlia is my uncle's daughter-in-law, who's a Talmudic scholar. And I want to say this email in itself really spoke to me of Mum's. I feel like she just identified as a human being, that maybe in today's day, she'd be a they. Anyway, Dahlia did write back. And then when we got her response, Mom said to me, don't worry, I'll work on this. And she at that time I was doing like she was writing an email. I'd type it for her. She'd I'd transcribe for her. So then, well, okay, I forgot about it. And I forgot about it until a few months after she had died. And I was sorting through some things in the room she was living in. And I did find she had indeed worked on it. And this is what she'd come with. And I feel that this really, truly does represent her. As a Jew, mindful of ghetto, shtetl, persecution, death camps, I've tried to live as a righteous person. Righteous is all-embracing. A person who tried in all dimensions and ways of life, whether in thinking, acting, or speaking, to be honest, decent, good, just, and loving, fits the title of righteous, all-embracing. Acknowledging what was given to me, wealth, privilege, my own forefathers, parents, brothers, dead beloved husband, Mervyn, Ida, Ezra, Ruth, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. Righteous is all-embracing, someone in past, present, and future, and with faith in those who follow. Righteousness is universal, all-embracing. Thank you.
So with that, that's that beautiful poem. I think we will close today, and just outside, more opportunities to mingle and catch up and talk about Zena. So yes, please, thank you for all the speakers, and thank you for all for coming.